Good afternoon. All right, so I have 7 of you. That's great. All right, so let's see here. So I put the names in here. We are now doing the second half of the Southern Colonies argumentative assignment, beginning with number 4, the information therein about slavery, transatlantic, sub-Saharan African slavery. Let's see here. Right. Sorry, it takes me a minute. Miss Maddie, if you don't mind, hon, if you could text me like your full name, so I make sure that you get your credit, okay? For being here on the Zoom, that would be great. Let's see here. Thank you, Maddie. Appreciate it. All right, so let's see here. We are going into the fourth section of the argumentative assignment on the Southern colonies. No problem. No need to apologize, Maddie. No, I that's cool. I just want to make sure I don't want to leave anything to chance. I want to give you your due credit for being here. So no problem at all. Okay, and so glad to have you guys again. And getting into slavery issue. Oh my goodness, right? Like where do you even begin with like the discourse on slavery? And so with number 4, right, I take a controversial, to say the least, turn. And remember, these are not necessarily what I personally adhere to. Okay, some of these I have tongue in cheek, with a grin on my face as I'm putting them together. All right, so remember that. But with number 4, in a very controversial, subjective manner, I try to convey the message that slavery was more about economics than it was about racism, right? More about economics than it was about racism. And of course, right, that the very word of racism is not very old, centuries wise. We're putting modern post civil rights movement discourse on a subject, going back to the 1400s, right, and the modern derivation of slavery. And so you have some warnings about that. Historians will tell you, but nevertheless, you don't have to have the word racism exist in the English lexicon to know that it could the reality of racism was alive and well, right? So we look at the primary sources of the time period. We try to infer from this and from that, right? Evidence of racism. And then, like I said, with number 4, in very controversial fashion, I brought forth look for the idea that slavery was it was about economics primarily, more than anything else. All right. So as you would guess, if you haven't had the chance to read number 4 yet, what are some of the typical arguments that will be made that are to be found in number 4? You could probably guess them, right? So one, right, you look at waning or diminishing opportunities to employ other demographics. So you're going to find an argument that, for instance, white indentured servants, right, became less manageable when you look at something like, and some people think that this has been overplayed, but you look at Bacon's Rebellion, okay, Howard Zinn's book, etc., and evidence that we've talked about this before, right, with indentured servants, the equivalent of doing a menial job today, but taking college classes at night, right? and expecting to rise up the socioeconomic ladder, right, and have more options in the future. And then when those options are denied you, right, hypothetically, because of your enhanced expectations, you're likely to become more um, rebellious, right? More contentious, more demanding as a demographic when you don't get what you expect, what you want, right? Imagine going through college, getting your degrees, and then they're not recognized. Those degrees are not recognized by employers, etc., out in the workforce, right? So there's a sense of disillusionment and anger, and contrast that, right, with African slaves who, if you've seen, the old movie in the 90s, Amistad, other documentaries, just to show the horrendous conditions endured by slaves. The famous Amistad case, a lot of that came to light in the 1830s in U.S. legal history. But at any rate, they have more access to more and more primary source data logs and memories of people interviewed, hard artifacts, etc., that just increasingly come to light to demonstrate how awful the slave trade was, right? And so, at any rate, you're looking at 12 million Africans taken against their will from sub-Saharan Africa to primarily the Caribbean and South America, to the Western Hemisphere, and of course to North America as well. So, at any rate, when they had come, the argument is, right, they didn't have any expectations, they didn't have any hope, chained and coffered, and so that may have arguably made them uh, more circumstantially a docile labor force that would do as it's told, have no hope for the future, and hence have no expectations, and hence be less inclined to rebel. So remember, all this is very contested. These claims I'm bringing up, and so, at any rate, you look at a waning or diminishing pool of white laborers. You see the Great Fire in London. You see other facts that might be conveyed in this section about just the numbers of able bodied, ambitious, poor white Englishmen and women um, just dwindling, especially at the key time of the mid 1600s. All right. And so, hence, there's a need, right, for an alternative labor force. You look at the debates Las Casas had with Sepulveda back in Spain, and you'll see plenty of evidence of the Spaniards being under the impression, and this seems to have been verified through multiple studies and so forth, what they call the demographic catastrophe. Native Americans dying by the millions throughout Latin America after the Spanish arrived. And some of that is absolutely attributed to overwork and being enslaved through the encomienda system, and not being able to endure or nor willing or able to procreate while they were a coerced labor force. So, hence, you were literally going to have writers, right? Um, Spanish writers and others as well of European extraction, who are going to contend that the African Americans are sturdier, are stronger of a people, and they can endure the conditions, and particularly, right, the conditions that are amenable to getting malaria and other tropical diseases, being waist deep in water in a sugarcane field, plantation, etc. Right, and so you look up alleged evidence of this with the claims of a sickle cell trait among sub-Saharan Africans, their ecosystem, climate, and everything around the Ivory Coast and its similarities, its quote tropic similarities with those of South Carolina, etc., that they had arguably developed antibodies and the physical immunity to malaria and other tropical diseases of sorts, to which the Native Americans supposedly had not been acclimated, and were not prepared. Their bodies were not prepared to fight off. So at any rate, you have that contention and that argument that's often made, right? That they were an alternative to white laborers, they were an alternative to Native American laborers. Okay, you have supply and demand and prices, right? That you'll find in number 4. And as you might guess, claims that the number of slaves that were available from sub-Saharan Africa increased greatly right at this key pivotal time in the mid 1600s. And then you also have contentions, right, that with those burgeoning numbers, and then I think a couple factors of that are examples of that are given. You'll find in number 4. Um, some case of conquest and war brought on in Africa itself, and some decisions made in Europe that had direct implications and consequences in Africa and in the Americas, with by increasing the number of able-bodied slaves that came in and were sold into the Caribbean and the Americas, right? And so, sadly, like any commodity, slaves, when the supply was quote glutted, the prices went down. And look for numbers on there as far as it being a more affordable price to just pay just a little bit more for a slave than you would an indentured servant, right? Of whom you would have access to his or her labor for just 3 to 7 years. And with a slave, you have the establishment of the slave codes, the origins of those as early as the 1640s. And now you have the weight of law behind it, right? Saying that these slaves, these African slaves, are to be enslaved for life, and their position is to be, their status is to be inherited by their children, right? And they went back and forth in different colonies as far as if they would follow the status of the father or of the mother. Maryland changed it back and forth a couple times, for instance. But still, it became an inherited lifelong institution. So you pay just a little bit more, right? And you could get a slave for life and his or her children. And so again, number 4, a very controversial, subjective claim. I just want to get you thinking. By all means, disagree with it. Okay, but evidence that leans toward economic reasoning, economic motives, right, for choosing uh, sub-Saharan African laborers as slaves, as the slave force when they wrote the slave codes beginning in the 1640s here on the east coast of the United States, right, in the colonies, especially the South. So at any rate, but notice what is conveniently left out, right, is there's not a whole lot on racism. So just to kind of FYI, if you ever have the time, by all means, this is never mandatory in the class, only the textbook. But I pretty much derived my thesis from The Slave Trade right here by Hugh Thomas. So to me, from what I read, I took it to be an economic thesis. All right, kind of economic determinism, and to the contrary, right? Right. Actually, this one stamped from the beginning by Ibram Kendi. Very very interesting, right? And he gets into primary source writers throughout the centuries, right? Who have developed stereotypes of sub-Saharan Africans, right? And you could probably easily guess if you've taken a US history class before, right? They're going to culminate in the later Sambo image, SAMBO, right? The beast animal-like, lacking self-control, um, sexual predator, intellectually ignorant um, sub-Saharan African man in particular, right? To justify them being enslaved, pure and simple, right? But Ibram Kendi, as much as he focuses upon racism and the procurers, those who carried these racist ideas and spread them with their books and their written words, right? uh, I think you'll find in here that he gives an economic take on quite a few of them, right? Saying, well, how convenient it was for this gentleman to write, right? For instance, the gentleman who wrote the biography for Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal, right? They were just beginning to turn to sub-Saharan African slaves. And what do you know? At that time, he starts fostering through his writings, his biography, right, which he knew would be widely read, negative stereotypes about Africans, right? Again, kind of toward that Sambo image that would be titled that later on. So you have that work. That's very interesting. And, so far I'm only about halfway through this book, but I find it to be pretty balanced, pretty well balanced as far as economic determinism and focus a lot on racism itself. And that's David Breon Davis, Inhuman Bondage. Really good book. Okay. So all three of these books are tremendous, in my opinion. So at any rate, go into this, right? You have those oh goodness, here just to give a couple examples. All right. First of all, it goes back to Aristotle. You look at Aristotle and notice what my point being here, guys, is on number 4. I don't focus on this. This is a convenient omission. I'm not given the opposition its fair opportunity to present itself, right? Like, what about the presence of racism, right? Alive and well in the colonies and centuries before that, right? So if you look at the David Breon Davis's book, for instance, right? He says you don't get anything exactly akin to black slavery in America as far as just how integral racism was in justifying it, right? You don't see that degree of it in Greece and Rome. He says, for instance, he goes back to Greece and Rome very abruptly, like to the Mid East, right? The Mesopotamia stuff. But he pretty much says, right, that for much of human history, prisoners of war and criminals, right, have been the two leading demographics that have been enslaved. Oftentimes, their status has not been inherited by their children. They have had limited rights for emancipation to free themselves, right? You do, however, have them objectified under law early on in human history, about being placed in the category of property, right? Like, sadly, not much different under the law in certain circumstances and contexts, as an ox, as a horse, as a plow, or some inanimate object that is owned by that slave owner, right? And so you have that early on. You also have a long human history of making the in sociology and psychology, the other, right? There's us, and then there's that other that we dehumanize very conveniently. And when you dehumanize that group, right? I mean, some people say, okay, why do you got to go to the extreme? You think of the Holocaust, right? The dehumanization of those who were not part of the people's community of Nazi Germany, and they were dehumanized years before the Holocaust was put into action. And so you have that, right, back in the ancient Mideast. You have that in Greece and Rome for sure. But when you look at it, right, there was a very polyglot, very diverse, ethnically diverse population that was enslaved, right, within Greece and Rome. And then he kind of fast forwards to when he covers the quote medieval time period after the fall of Rome in the 400s, right? He focuses more on the Mid East with Islam, the rise of Islam in the 600s, right? And they're capturing a people and justifying it, right, through religion, but again, not necessarily ethnicity. You also have the very term slave, right, comes from Slav, like the Russian Slavic people of the Balkans of Europe, right? Those are white European people, and they were a large demographic that was enslaved by Islamic empires, right? Especially toward the end of the medieval time period, culminating with the mighty Turkish Ottoman Empire, right? And so you have people from the Caucasus and the Black Sea and the Balkans that are white Europeans that are being enslaved, going up to close to the 1400s, who are being enslaved and put on sugar islands into the Mediterranean primarily, and also even some of the small Atlantic islands initially, the Canary Islands, the Madeira and Sao Tome outside of the African coast. And so obviously, right, it wasn't always initially supposedly, right, or inevitably to be sub-Saharan Africans. But when you look at some of these writers, right, you find plenty of evidence early on throughout the centuries, right, of a consistent um, stigmatization, right, of stigma, putting a stigma upon African Americans beneath the Sahara Desert. So you have, for instance, um, Ibn Khaldun, Khaldun, Gomez Zurara, Zurara, Alonso de Zuazo, Zuazo, Leo Africanus, right? Africanus. You have Rabbi Hia, Hiyya. You have Jahiz Basra, Jahiz Basra, Basra. Now, amongst some of these Jewish and Arabic Islamic writers, right, you're going to see the early signs of that Sambo image of African Americans being physically strong but intellectually weak. So hence they're fit to do physical labor and nothing better and nothing other than that, right? The fears of them with sex, right, with the men, the contesting that the men lack sexual control and had large genitalia, and they were like the likened. This makes me feel uncomfortable, but likened to the apes of Africa, etc. I mean, just terrible, terrible stuff you have written by these gentlemen throughout the centuries, Jewish, Islamic, and Christian, European, Near Eastern, and Asian, writing of sub-Saharan Africans, right? And so notice none of that is brought up in number 4. You have cases once they got here, right? Of of people like John Pory, Pory. Look him up. He was in a part of writing some of the initial slave codes, and he had read Leo Africanus and these other writers and their racist assumptions about black men beneath the Sahara Desert. Right? He not only had read, but he even translated and promoted those works to be read by others. Right? And so there's good evidence that he may have been likely influenced by those racist writings as he wrote, um, you know, uh, one of the colonies' slave codes. And so then you have cases like Antonio the Negro Johnson. Look up his case. Them taking land from him in Virginia after he had moved, had family and had moved to Maryland, I believe. And coming back, they just decided that it's not appropriate for a man of his color to own property in Virginia. Look up a gentleman named John Punch, who ran away with other indentured servants under the same term, had the same amount of time left. His 2 companions got a much more lenient punishment. He got a lifelong punishment for having run away, and they made it pretty explicitly clear that it was because he was black, and the other 2 runaway indentured servants were white. So you have evidence of this, right? Of African Americans seen and stigmatized as the other, right? The beginnings of the formation, the synthesis of the Sambo image, right? The ignorant, happy-go-lucky, physically strong, sexually aggressive African American who needs to be held under supervision, who needs to be told what to do, who lacks the intelligence and the self-control to be self-sufficient on his own anyway. And so it's actually a societal good to have him under a white master. All this condescending stuff, right? But also, again, economically convenient stuff, right? And so I want to end this discourse in just saying, right? Obviously, I don't think it even needs to be said to you, it doesn't have to be one or the other, right? And so many things of life that are so complex and messy, it very likely was both of these, right? Dovetailing together, economic self-interest and a long history of racism directed toward African Americans. And let me just say one more thing about that racism, and I want to open it up if any of you have any comments or questions. is of course what I find very interesting and relevant to this dialogue, right, is the fact that some of these racist writers, right, wrote under the assumption of environmental determinism, that Africans beneath the Sahara Desert were uncivilized and barbaric because of their surroundings, because of their conditions, because of historical circumstances and their geographic isolation from the other continents, and through the barrier of the Sahara Desert. And so hence, right, you could guess, right, that if they believe that you're inferior um, because of circumstances, because of your environment, right? There's hope for you in their society, in their system, right? Because they're implying that you could become civilized. You could be removed from one environment and put into a healthier, more quote civilized environment, and that it will enhance you culturally, intellectually, your values, your worldview, your behavior, right? Can all mend for the better. And uh, and then of course the second category is innate, right? And if they believe that you are biologically, innately inferior, then there's less hope, if any, right? Because then after all, right, you can't, if you dehumanize a group, you bring that quote animal from one environment to another, it doesn't matter, right? That animal is still an animal. And so needless to say, that gets tougher as far as finding remedies to this quote race problem throughout the centuries, long after slavery will be abolished, right? If you have intellectual foundations for racism that involve stigmatizing them innately, that no matter what you do with them, they are less than human. They are inferior to European people of European extraction. So, any questions or comments on this, you guys? Anybody? All right, you guys are quiet. All right, so that's okay as long as you're with me. Um, so then moving on with this, right? Um, if you'll bear with me here and sharing the screen, you see here. So moving on down from number 4, we have African American agency. I believe it's number 7. We have Native American agency. Yes. So 5 and 7, right? Remember the term agency is that during and after the civil rights movement, right? Different historians would say, you know what? We're tired of just the conflict history of African Americans, Native Americans, and these other demographics um, who are depicted as having lost, right, politically, economically, socially, in history, and that we just we depict them as victims, and of course we want to elicit sympathy for their plight, right? But yet we don't want this group of historians, post civil rights movement. They said we don't want the story to end there, right? That in a way, even though however well-meaning it could be, it's condescending, right? Depicting African Americans, Native Americans, women, etc., as just these passive victims to everything, right? So they say no. We want to emphasize. We're going to find evidence for, and we're going to magnify for everybody to read instances, ways in which these demographics demonstrated their historical agency, that they were free moral agents who made decisions that mattered, right? That turned history in this direction or that direction, et cetera, right? So, a very common example you find in American historiography of US history is found in the culture creating capacity of slaves, right? Saying, hey, granted, they were in, you know, uh, an economically marginalized and exploited and a politically disenfranchised position, right? They were left out for sure, these slaves, right? But that isn't the end of the story. They made decisions, they developed coping mechanisms, right? And something as seemingly trivial as cuisine, with food, with music, of course, with Christianity and their adoption of Christianity, and their own kind of blended ways of practicing Christianity, incorporating African customs and traditions, etc., right? And even musical instruments and practices, the call and response, etc., right? So that they would help determine the manner by which Southern culture would go, even though they were just supposedly helpless slaves, right? So that's an example of moral agency of groups that historically had been simply depicted as innocent victims, right? To whom everything happened to them passively. So when you look at number 5, right, you could find a window of time, arguably, in this book called Black Majority by Peter Wood, right? And I thought it was interesting and worth noting. And in his book, he contends that when South Carolina briefly was a private colony, right, a private joint stock company owned, controlled colony, that African Americans took advantage of an acute need for their labor, something seemingly as non-political as attacks of some species of a mountain lion, of a jaguar, there in the Carolinas, right? Attacking the people. Um, the joint stock company's decision to highly invest in making the glue for the old ships, right, from the sap of trees, right? It became kind of an uncomfortable, somewhat intricate job, cutting and killing the trees, specific trees, right? Putting vats into them and heating up the sap and mixing it with other elements to make this perfect adhesive for shipbuilding at that time, right? And and other instances as well. Cultivation of rice and indigo in South Carolina was big, etc. That there was such supposedly a great need of these private company owners to get more labor and employ more labor, right? That in that desperation, they became willing to bargain with the African slaves. And again, that the African slaves were no dummies. They utilized their shrewdness, right? Their pragmatic self-interest, and made demands and said, "Oh, you want me to hunt the jaguars? You want me to to kill the trees and to utilize this process of making the adhesive for ships? Well, what's in it for me? Otherwise, I'm not doing it." And so, what do you know? You have evidence of a large, a disproportionately in this time window, right, of South Carolina, um, a disproportionate number of manumissions of legal freedom granted to many African slaves, or something in the middle, right? Limited freedom, money on the side to gain, to acquire, to buy their freedom eventually, etc., etc. So you find that on number 5. And then on number 7, and I'm going to go back to number 6, okay? But again, they're the same, thematically, the same, type of history, is you find the fact that Native Americans at given times did the same, right? So, for instance, it's not on this one, but I want to give you as an example because it may be relevant to the first test, okay? Is the famous Iroquois, right? Iroqu. Gosh, I got to write it out. I'm so terrible. I don't know my French. Iroquois, right? The Iroquois. This tribe, and largely in present day New York, they began to realize the great profitability and European and Euro American demand for pelts, right? Otter and beaver pelts, etc., right? Especially beaver pelts in the freshwater rivers. So they took over the St. Lawrence Valley of Canada, right, just above the Great Lakes, from the Huron, Huron tribe, and so that they could be the providers of these pelts and they could set the price for them, right? Now, in hindsight, 2020 is, hindsight is 2020. So you look at it now, and yes, they incurred great short-term wealth through the fur trade, but in doing so, right, they became more, nomadically inclined, more inclined to sell their lands, thinking, okay, we're making a fortune, right, in this somewhat money economy. We'll stay on the move and follow the pelts. Well, that doesn't last, obviously. And in hindsight, right, the Iroquois are not any longer, even remotely autonomous over the state of New York any longer, right? So even if you believe in hindsight that the decision was ill advised, didn't work out in the long run, you still have to respect within historiography the fact that they made decisions that mattered, that helped determine their own fate and the fate of others, right? Even if it didn't work out in their best interest in the long run. And that's what you find here in number 7 is different tribes along the Mississippi River who were able to dictate terms to the French rather than the other way around. Okay. And so for one, I thought that that was, again, relevant to the historiography of agency of Native Americans, African Americans, etc. Right, but also just mindful of the fact that we're speaking English right now, not French. So when the French come as imperialists and by way of quote discovery and quote conquest try to claim North America, they're ultimately going to lose, particularly by 1763 and the 7 Years' War against Great Britain, right? And so, for one, you see kind of the seeds to that. They just simply they didn't invest enough resources to hold on to North America as imperialists. And then also, right, again, you see the power of free will, right, of free moral agency practiced by the Native Americans. Even if you finish reading Daniel Usner's book, and you almost feel as if the natives have been quasi vilified because of the way they manipulated the French. It doesn't change the fact that it adheres to that moral agency theme of history writing, right? Boasting of the fact that Native Americans made decisions that mattered, that helped dictate the way history, the directions in which history has gone. Then going back to number 6, I think the title says it all. Of course, slave conditions were awful. Believe it or not, Fogel and Ingerman wrote a book called Time on the Cross, in which they tried to make the argument that that slaves' conditions were not that bad materially or physically, right? They didn't even try to get into the emotional and psychological elements to slavery, right? They didn't pretend to, but they said simply just their material circumstances, right? And their thesis was pretty simple in that they stated that what largely ensured somewhat humane treatment of the slaves was the expensive nature of of them as investments, right? That if sadly, if you buy an expensive car, again, they were known as under the category of chattel slavery, of like an inanimate object, a farm object property owned by the plantation owner. And so hence, you buy a very expensive tractor, car, horse, ox. You want it to, give you your investment back. You want it to maximize its efficiency and giving you, bang for your buck. So hence it was in the best interest of the slave owners to feed their slaves well and keep them strong and healthy, to give them medical attention, not to maim them or hurt them too badly when administering punishment of any sort, etc., etc. Well, needless to say, number 6 goes against that thesis, that famous book, right? And says no, there is plenty of evidence of slaves being miserable, being defiant, taking great risks and running away, right? And especially when I say great risks, in light of the draconian rules that were put into effect. So, for instance, in some instances, you raise your hand in a threatening manner to your master, you could lose your life, uh, and be heavily chastised. In certain cases, you could be, in the case of them chastising you and whipping you, if they are to kill you. In some cases, they're to pay a nominal fee and to register it with the state or colonial government, and that's it. They don't even get punished because, after all, it's their property that they quote killed. I mean, so these slave codes were just draconian, right? And so to see the degree and evidence of rebellion against them, right? Some would say is an argument for how miserable the slave conditions must have been for them to take such risks. So a lot of it of number 6 is inferential. It's inferences. Because of this fact and that fact, it stands to reason that it must have been like this or must have been like that. And then, of course, you have some more direct evidence, like the skeletal remains of slaves in the slave quarters, evidence of physical damage done prematurely to the men and women, uh, evidence for them doing very heavy, arduous, burdensome physical labor, etc. And not to mention the psychological part to it, right? In which we see the mistress's writings that we have to this day as primary sources, as evidence that suggest there was a lot of psychological torment endured by slaves, in particular the house slaves, those who stayed within the house and not out on the plantation, in closer, constant proximity and under tighter supervision of their white masters. All right. And then number 8, I think the title says it all. French Louisiana, fluid by accident. And what I mean by fluid, right, is what is by today's standards, what we're proud of, right, is that this is arguably a land of opportunity, right? Sorry, I was going to cease to share. Not that I'm eager to put my mug back up here, but I just don't need this anymore as a reference. But at any rate, you see it here. The let's see here, stop share. All right, sorry. All right, so with the last one, right? Evidence that within French Louisiana, more opportunities arose for more people than were ever initially intended. Okay, if you remember that, you'll get that question right on test 1. Okay, that allowing more opportunities for more people in French Louisiana, right? That it was not a premeditated, um, intellectual decision made by the French rulers that, you know what, we want to land here in North America that offers more opportunity for more people than back in France, right? But that no, that they largely had the typical imperialist design to replicate their own society that they were used to back in France, right? That they wanted to just bring that cultural baggage from France and replicate it here in French Louisiana, but that the conditions did not work. And largely, right, again, so much of it, according to the book that I'm going off of on the last section, went down to a scarcity of resources. They didn't have enough soldiers, evidently, to enforce discipline in French Louisiana. They didn't have enough French goods coming to them to meet their demand. And they didn't have enough French women to come and establish, quote, French kind of homogenous French population. And so the very, highly superior numbers of men in the gender imbalance are going to marry indigenous, African, Afro-Caribbean, and other women of other demographics, right? And have much less homogeneously a French citizenry than the French leaders intended and wanted, right? So you look for evidence of that. And then another example, going back to what I just said, the scarcity of resources, you literally have one, if not two, if I recall, I know one for sure from this book, one, if not two French governors, right? Military governors of Louisiana, who wrote back to their French commanders and stated, right? If we do not get the resources we need, we are going to proceed to buy and sell with the whoever's available, the lowest bidders, right? Whoever that might be. And so, because remember, under the old school pre-French Revolution, pre-Enlightenment France, right? You know, Louis the 14th and all that, right? Where he said, "I am the state" to Parliament, right? That shows you how kind of archaic and old school his political system was. The nobility, you know, rolling the roost along with him, etc. Right? Is you have the the mercantilist system, right? And remember, under mercantilism, the crown decides the allocation of economic resources and opportunities and is unapologetic about it, saying that resources are finite, they will eventually run out, and it is my prerogative as king or queen of France, right, to dictate who gets monopolies in what areas and who has opportunities in what areas, right, et cetera, et cetera. So coming from that mercantilist tradition, you know, that to us is anathema. That's like accursed now, right? That goes against the grain of everything we've been brought up with our rhetoric as modern Americans, right? That this is a land of equality of opportunity for everybody. And so not so under mercantilism, not so under early modern Europe, including especially France. But again, they try to replicate that in the Americas and they don't have enough workers. They're desperate for more laborers. So what do? They offer them higher wages and enfranchisement as subjects or citizens, right? And other options that were not initially intended to be given to them because of desperation. They don't have enough goods, right? So I kid you not, French Louisiana, New Orleans in particular, right, will develop a reputation as a haven for pirates, right? You know, the whole Pirates of the Caribbean stuff, right? There is historical truth to that title and that phenomenon. And so you look up people like Blackbeard. I've read on a gentleman. It was interesting. Jean Lafitte, Laffite, I believe it is. Jean Lafitte, right? He was a pretty he engaged definitely in deviant behavior. He broke customs. He broke the law. He had people murdered, evidently, in his in his piracy, in his business, his illegal business. And he would come into New Orleans like a rock star. And he had a nice place he would stay, go to the nicest restaurants and theater, and people just showed deference to him, right? But he provided a lot of scarce and highly coveted goods that no one else provided. And so the authorities just turned a blind eye and put up with him on many accounts. And so, at any rate, you have that, and I thought that was interesting, right? That argument in American historiography is that in some cases, some people believe, you know, remember court history praising this country as being exceptional, being a little bit better than other countries, that this land, almost by accident, by historical circumstance, became, right, a land of more opportunity for more people, right? But again, not by design. We don't get that argument at least until usually William Penn, which we'll get to rather soon. All right. So, are there any questions or comments, you guys? I finally finished the material. No problem, Madison. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, no problem, Bella. Thank you, Bella. Speaking of which, I have a number of two more than I had initially written down. So let me find my list and make sure that I get the other two so everyone gets his or her credit. So Isabella and let's see. Sorry, still looking for. There we go. I found the other one. All right. So, okay, good, good, good. I want to make sure that everyone gets his or her credit. All right. So, do you guys have any last minute questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a question. It's about
Sure.
the recording of the meetings. They still say that it's like unpublished, so we can't actually see them.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. So, if you would please, okay, if you in the next, just in the next day or two, if you would please, just a couple of you, send me a Canvas message to verify if that is still the case. I'm going to try one more tactic, and then beyond that, what I'm going to have to do until I get a word from the proper people at our school is I'm going to write a summary for those who couldn't make it to this meeting. I'm going to write a summary literally of each number because that's what I'm doing already verbally. And I'd rather err on the side of spoon feeding you guys um, than that's okay, Mr. Perez. You get credit for it. I'll give you credit for it. But that I would rather err on the side of spoon feeding you guys than not giving you enough and you not being able to open these videos up, especially those of you who are working and just physically cannot make it to these meetings at the times in which I do them. So thank you for letting me know that. I'm going to try at least one more tactic. I'm going to wait to hear back. Okay, no problem. I'm going to wait to hear back from the proper people who can help me technologically. And in the meantime, I'm just going to write a summary for everyone else. Thank you so much for letting me know about that. Okay,
Oh, thank you so much for doing that for us.
no problem. That's the least I can do. All right. Anyone else? All right. So I have all your names. You guys have a great week, okay? And and take care of yourselves. And yeah, like I said, if I could just hear from a couple of you via Canvas message, if my last minute attempts have worked or not, I would really appreciate that, okay? All right. Thank you, everybody, okay? You guys have a good day. Have a good week. Or actually a good day. We do it twice a week, don't we? So I'll see you guys Wednesday, hopefully. Okay. All right. Take care. Thank you.